Mount Hermon rises 9,232 feet above the border between Lebanon and Syria. It is the highest point in the entire Levant. In a Jewish text written around the 3rd century before Christ, that mountain is assigned a very specific role. It is the place where 200 celestial beings came down and swore an oath to one another. The text is called the Book of the Watchers. It forms the opening section of what is known today as First Enoch. And it is not in the Bible that most people watching this video own. What makes this worth examining is not the existence of an apocryphal book. Apocryphal books exist by the hundreds. What makes this worth examining is that Genesis, the canonical book, describes the same event in 4 verses, explaining nothing, Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. And thousands of miles away, centuries before either of those texts existed, scribes in Mesopotamia were pressing into clay tablets a story with the identical shape. Beings who descend from above, knowledge handed to humanity, and a flood that arrives immediately after. The anomaly starts with how Genesis writes it. The text never introduces the characters. It mentions them the way a writer mentions something the reader already knows. It refers to the sons of God without ever defining what a son of God is. It refers to the Nephilim using the definite article, the way you cite a term already in circulation. And then it moves on. 4 verses, and the narrator advances to the flood without a single line of explanation. That is strange, because the Hebrew Bible is not a book that runs short on words for things it considers important. It spends entire chapters on the measurements of the tabernacle. It spends genealogies on dozens of names. It spends detailed instructions on fabrics, on sacrifices, on the thickness of curtains. And it spends 4 verses on the union between celestial beings and human women, an event that, by the internal logic of the text itself, is the direct cause of the destruction of all life on earth. This is not a minor narrative gap. It is the most visible hole in the entire Torah, and it split Jewish and Christian interpretive schools for more than 2,000 years, without any of them managing to close it for good. The Hebrew has to be read carefully, because translation hides half the problem. The phrase rendered as sons of God is bene ha-Elohim. It is not unique to Genesis. It appears in the book of Job, chapter 1, verse 6, and again in chapter 2, verse 1, describing beings who present themselves before God in what reads like a celestial assembly. It appears again in Job 38, verse 7, where the bene ha-Elohim shout for joy while the foundations of the earth are laid. In every one of those cases, without exception, the phrase describes celestial beings and not men. That is why the angelic reading of Genesis 6 was never a modern invention. It is simply the ordinary use of the phrase inside the Bible itself. The second word is Nephilim. The most likely Hebrew root is naphal, meaning to fall. Nephilim would be, literally, the fallen ones. There is a competing proposal drawn from the Aramaic Nephilah, meaning giant, and scholars are still arguing over which is correct. When Jewish translators carried the text into Greek in the 3rd century before Christ, they picked one word, gigantes, giants. And there is a third term in verse 4 that almost nobody notices. The children born of that union are called gibborim, the mighty ones, men of renown. It is the same word used for the great warriors of Israel. The text does not present them as monsters. It presents them as heroes, men with names. And Genesis is not the only place in the canon where this category of being shows up. In the book of Daniel, chapter 4, verses 13, 17, and 23, a celestial being descends from heaven during Nebuchadnezzar's dream. The Aramaic word used there is ear. It means, literally, the one who watches, the one who stays awake. It is the word watcher inside the canon, in a book nobody disputes. Outside the canon, that same figure acquires a name, a number, and an address. The Book of the Watchers describes 200 beings descending onto Hermon in the days of Jared. Their leader is called Semjaza, and the text records something that reads like a minor detail and is not. They swear a mutual oath before descending, a blood pact, so that none of them can back out. The text then explains the name of the mountain from that oath, tying Hermon to the Hebrew root for curse and binding vow. It is a deliberate play on words. And there is a second one. Jared, the patriarch in whose days all of this happens, comes from the root Yared, which means to descend. The name of Enoch's father, recorded in Genesis chapter 5, literally means descent. Then comes the catalogue. In chapter 8 of the same book, each watcher teaches a specific technology. Azazel teaches the making of swords, knives, shields and breastplates, and also the metals of the earth, the art of working them, and cosmetics, bracelets, ornaments, the pigments for the eyes, and precious stones. Barakijal teaches astrology. Kokabel teaches the signs of the stars. Arakiel teaches the signs of the earth. Shamsil, the signs of the sun. Sariel, the course of the moon. This is not a list of moral failings. It is a list of technologies. Metallurgy, weaponry, cosmetics, mining, and astronomical observation. That is the central accusation of the text. The crime of the Watchers was not only the biological mixing, it was the transfer of knowledge humanity was not supposed to have yet. And these texts are not medieval. They were found at Qumran, in the Judean desert, written in Aramaic, in fragments dated as early as the 3rd century before Christ. 11 separate copies of Enoch have been identified there. Josephus, the Jewish historian of the 1st century, records the angelic reading as current among the Jews of his time, and explicitly compares the offspring of that union to the giants of Greek tradition. Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and Tertullian all worked from the same reading. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church never let the book go. It sits inside their canon to this day. And the letter of Jude, inside the New Testament, at verses 14 and 15, quotes a prophecy of Enoch by name, word for word. There is one detail that will only make sense at the end of this video, but it has to be planted now. Among the fragments recovered from the caves at Qumran, there is a text scholars call the Book of Giants. It is a Jewish narrative about the sons of the Watchers, written in Aramaic, preserved by the same community that preserved the biblical manuscripts. And in that text, the giants appear with proper names. One of those names has no business being there. It is not Hebrew. It is not an invention of the author. It is the name of a character who comes from another people, another language, and another religion. Hold on to that, because it is the single piece that turns an interesting coincidence into concrete evidence. To understand the scale of what is at stake here, you have to leave Israel and go to Mesopotamia. There, long before Genesis existed in the form we know, a tradition already circulated about supernatural sages who taught civilization to mankind. They are called the Apkallu. There are 7 of them. They are described as sent up out of the primordial waters, associated with the god Ea, and their function is stated outright in the texts. They hand human beings writing, mathematics, agriculture, architecture, law, and the working of metal. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek around the 3rd century before Christ, preserves the most detailed version. He describes a figure called Oans, a being partly fish in form, who emerges from the sea, spends the day among men teaching, and returns to the water at nightfall. According to Berossus, after that instruction, nothing new was ever invented. The whole of human civilization had already been delivered. Picture the situation. 2 cultures, separated by different languages, different pantheons, and centuries of distance, both have to account for the same thing. Why civilization appeared so abruptly, and both give the same structural answer. Someone came down and taught, and both place that teaching immediately before a flood. In the Babylonian poem of Error, the 7 sages are banished back to the watery abyss, to the Apsu, by divine decree. The structure is identical to Enoch, where the watchers are bound and cast into the depths until the day of judgment. Descent, forbidden instruction, punishment, confinement in the abyss. 2 traditions, 1 skeleton. And this is where the Anunnaki enter, with a qualification that has to be stated plainly. The term Anunnaki is Sumerian and appears with varying spellings across more than 2,000 years of texts. The reading accepted by Assyriology is offspring of the prince, or offspring of An, and being the sky god. The Anunnaki are, in that sense, the children of heaven in a genealogical and divine sense. They are the assembly of the great Mesopotamian gods, and in a number of texts they function as judges of the underworld. The translation popularized in the 1970s, which renders Anunnaki as those who from heaven to earth came, and which became the foundation of the entire ancient astronaut literature, is not accepted by any current in academic Assyriology. It forces the etymology. This video does not rest on it. And that needs saying clearly, because the real argument is far stronger without it. The real argument is structural. Across the Eastern Mediterranean and Mesopotamia, there is a persistent cultural memory of celestial beings who descended, transmitted technology, and produced a generation of giants that had to be wiped out. The Greeks kept that memory under different names. In Hesiod's Theogony, the Titans are defeated and imprisoned in Tartarus, the deepest region of the underworld. When Jewish translators carried Genesis into Greek, they chose Gigantes for Nephilim, a word that to any Greek reader pointed straight at the war of the giants against the gods. And when the second letter of Peter, at chapter 2 verse 4, describes the angels who sinned being cast into chains of darkness, the Greek verb used is tartaroo, to cast into Tartarus. It is the only occurrence of that word in the entire New Testament. A Christian author in the 1st century, writing about fallen angels, reached for the vocabulary of Greek mythology to describe where they ended up. Picture 3 independent libraries, the Hebrew, the Mesopotamian, and the Greek, with no coordination and no shared project, each needing to name the same category of being. They use different words, and they describe the same behavior. Now the detail left hanging. The Book of Giants, recovered at Qumran, across several separate fragments, narrates the dreams and the fate of the sons of the Watchers. And among the names of the giants listed in that Jewish text is Gilgamesh, the hero of the Mesopotamian epic, the king of Uruk, the central figure of Babylonian literature, catalogued by Jewish scribes as one of the Nephilim. Beside him appears a second recognizable name, Hobabish, almost certainly a form of Humbaba, the monstrous guardian of the cedar forest in that same epic. This is not thematic resemblance. It is not a shared archetype. It is a foreign, proper name, lifted out of one literature and reclassified inside another. The Jewish authors of that text were not merely telling a story that happened to resemble the Mesopotamian one. They were stating outright that the heroes of that tradition belong to the same category of being Genesis calls Nephilim. It is the literal bridge between the two mythologies, written on leather, stored in a cave, and dated more than 2,000 years ago. And it is necessary to be completely honest at this point, because that honesty is what separates this argument from an empty theory. None of this proves that a single literal race existed under 3 names. What is proven is contact between the traditions. The Jews knew Mesopotamian literature. They were carried into captivity in Babylon, absorbed its vocabulary, and reinterpreted its figures inside their own theology. The dominant academic explanation is exactly that, a shared cultural substrate across the ancient Near East, not a historical memory of real beings. The Bible never says the Anunnaki are the watchers. That equation is interpretation, not text. What the text does offer is subtler and in some ways more unsettling. Peoples who despised each other, who worshipped rival gods and wrote in incompatible languages, all looked back at the same pre-flood period and described the same thing happening in it. It is worth assembling all of it in order, because once the sequence is laid out, the picture that emerges is remarkably coherent. First, a canonical book, Genesis, records in 4 verses a union between celestial beings and women, the birth of a generation called Nephilim, and immediately afterward the divine decision to destroy the earth. Second, the same canon confirms the vocabulary elsewhere. Job uses bene Elohim for celestial beings. Daniel uses the Aramaic word for watcher. Numbers at chapter 13 verse 33 records the Anakim as descendants of the Nephilim and does so after the flood. Third, a body of ancient Jewish literature, demonstrably pre-Christian by the Qumran fragments, expands the episode with a number, a location, proper names, and a catalogue of transmitted technologies. Fourth, that literature was known and quoted inside the New Testament, by Jude explicitly and by Peter through the vocabulary of Tartarus. Fifth, Mesopotamia already possessed, before any of it, a tradition of 7 sages sent from above, who delivered civilization to mankind and were afterward confined in the abyss. Sixth, the scribes at Qumran closed the circuit themselves, placing the Mesopotamian hero inside the roster of Jewish giants. And there is one final geographic layer that usually goes unnoticed. At the base of Mount Hermon, the same mountain where the Book of the Watchers places the descent of the 200, stood an ancient city called Caesarea Philippi, built around a grotto consecrated to underworld deities. It is in exactly that place, according to Matthew chapter 16, that Jesus makes the statement about the gates of Hades not prevailing. The choice of setting may be coincidence. A number of scholars argue that it is not, and that the geography was deliberate. What can be said with confidence is that the same mountain that opens the story of rebellion in the oldest text reappears in the latest one, attached to the same theme, the confrontation between what descends from above and what rises out of the abyss. If this mystery made you look at the 4 quietest verses in Genesis differently, subscribe. There is a great deal still buried in these texts, waiting to be dug up.